Hello friends, today we will talk about Everest again. The year is 1963. The golden age of mountaineering is coming to an end. Many of the world's highest peaks have already been conquered. Only one 8,000er remains unconquered. In 1953, as part of a British expedition, Sir Edmund Hillary and his partner Tenzing Norgay conquered the highest point on the planet, the summit of Everest. There were rumors that in 1952, a year earlier, the Soviet Union had attempted to climb Everest from the north, but failed. Although, to be honest, I don't really believe these stories. What is known for certain is that in 1956, a Swiss expedition made the second ascent. China claimed to have made an ascent from the north side in 1960, but this also raises many questions, and the ascent has not been officially recognized. And then, in 1963, the Americans finally reached Everest. This brought us one of the most interesting and technically difficult climbs in the history of mountaineering, which we will discuss today. Dear friends, a reminder: don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. This really helps with the promotion and development of the channel. Thank you. And let's start, as usual, from afar. 1963. It is important to understand the atmosphere of that time. It was the height of the Cold War, the Caribbean crisis, the space race, the arms race, and competition in everything possible. Mountains were no exception. 10 years have passed since Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay climbed to the summit of Everest, and since then only a few people have stood at the highest point on the planet. No many wanted to, but not many succeeded. And of course, for America, it was an important step for its reputation. In 1963, they assembled a very large, well-trained, and very well-equipped expedition. Failure was not an option. The goal was to climb Everest. It was a matter of national importance. The expedition was led by 44-year-old Norman Dyrenfurt, a Swiss-American mountaineer and a truly formidable climber. Before that, all expeditions to the Himalayas had an army-like atmosphere. Many people gathered in the mountains and took the mountain as if it were under siege. They prepared for months, set up numerous camps, transported tons of cargo, and all decisions were made by one person, the expedition leader. This expedition did not differ much in style. There were only 900 porters who transported 27 tons of cargo to the camps. But Dyrenfurt proved to be a very insightful leader and gave the climbers a little more freedom, making decisions at general meetings. When climber Jake Breitenbach died in a serac collapse on the Khumbu Icefall on March 23, 1963, he raised the question of ending the expedition, but the majority voted to continue the climb. Dyrenfurt's main weapon was, of course, the strongest climbers. He assembled the best of the best. In addition, he developed a very detailed plan for the ascent, or rather, several plans, but more on that later. He decided to send climbers to the summit in pairs, hoping that sooner or later they would reach the top. He had at least 2 assault teams. And of course, his minimum goal was to have the first Americans set foot on the summit of Everest. This had to be achieved by any means necessary. And in general, by sending teams to the summit, sooner or later someone would get there. It was a good plan. And so, on May 1, 1963, climber James Whittaker, a 32-year-old salesman of tourist equipment, and his Sherpa, Nang Gumbu, the 28-year-old nephew of the first man to climb Everest, Tenzing Norgay, reached the summit of Everest. Dyrenfurt himself turned back a few meters short of the summit. It was a success. The minimum goal had been achieved. Americans had been to the top of Everest. But as I said, Dyrenfurt had several assault teams. Conquering Everest via the classic route is, of course, impressive, but it was as if they were following in the footsteps of the British. There was no record or first ascent involved. And as I mentioned, Dyrenfurt was quite democratic and listened to the climbers and their ideas. So climbers Tom Hornbein and Willi Unsoeld decided to take a risk and presented him with a plan for a completely new ascent. They wanted to climb Everest via the West Ridge. It was a completely new route that no one had ever taken before, very technically difficult. To this day, only a few climbers have taken this route. It is indeed an extremely difficult track, and the mortality rate among climbers is simply enormous. It was a dangerous and ambitious undertaking. The ascent of the West Ridge was led by Tom Hornbein, a 32-year-old anesthesiologist from St. Louis, and Willi Unsoeld, a 36-year-old Peace Corps volunteer from Kathmandu. 3 years earlier, they had made the first ascent of the steep and dangerous Masherbrum in Pakistan, 7,659 meters together. At that time, only Unsoeld and George Bell reached the summit. Although they respected Whitaker's achievement as the first American to climb Everest, they were not particularly interested in the route via the South Col. For them, it was not prestigious. They wanted a record and a first ascent, to go where no one had gone before. In their opinion, there was only one challenge worthy of their efforts: the West Ridge of Everest. Even now, 60 years after that climb, this route is considered one of the most technically difficult in mountaineering. Climber Brent Bishop wrote about it this way: "This is undoubtedly the most significant American climb in the Himalayas to date, and it happened 60 years ago. Using aerial photography, they drafted a route. But even on paper, it all looked simply monstrous. Starting from base camp and crossing the Khumbu Icefall, the climb to the West Ridge passes through the first 2 camps, which coincide with the route through the South Col. From there, they turn left, climbing the western slope of the mountain at an altitude of 7,800 meters and traversing into Tibet along the giant northern slope of Everest. The climbers then ascend a steep strip of snow cover resembling a double black diamond, an object that the 1963 team named the Hornbein Couloir. They then return to the ridge itself, where a series of rocks rise to a height of 1,216 meters. This route already leads to the summit. Now a few words about the team that decided to undertake such a climb. Hornbein came across as both a bore and an incredibly confident person, capable of turning off his oxygen at an altitude of 8,300 meters to write a letter home and study the effect of hypoxia on his handwriting. Unsoeld was a kind of charismatic madman who named his daughter Nanda Devi after India's second highest peak. Climber Willi Unsoeld considered risk a necessary element of successful mountain climbing and was generally a rather peculiar person. From evening conversations recorded as part of a psychological study commissioned by the U.S. Navy and devoted to people in states of stress and isolation, we learned that Hornbein and Unsoeld presented their project to Dyrenfurt and 16 other climbers. At first, Dyrenfurt did not want to hear anything about it. Unsoeld later recalled, he really didn't take the West Ridge seriously. He was passionate about achieving the stated goal of the expedition. Only when the entire expedition strongly supported the attempt to climb the West Ridge did he begin to change his views. But the expedition leader had his doubts. An entry in his diary shows that Dyrenfurt believed Hornbein was willing to jeopardize the success of the entire expedition because of his idea to climb the West Ridge. In a video report, Unsoeld expressed his dissatisfaction with Dyrenfurt's decision. He says, "The Sherpas were removed from the West Ridge and mainly focused on the route through the saddle. Additional climbers were transferred to the saddle. In our opinion, this demonstrated Norman's indecisiveness. He lacked the determination to implement the plan to traverse the West Ridge. Moreover, the initial plans came very easily to him, and he changed them with extreme carelessness." And everyone calmed down a little only on May 1, 1963, when the first American set foot on the summit of Everest. The expedition's task was accomplished, and from then on, it was possible to improvise. Dyrenfurt had several more assault teams that he planned to send along the classic route through the South Col. Unsoeld and Hornbein were left to their own devices, so to speak. I don't think anyone was particularly counting on them. Would they manage to climb the Western Ridge? Fine, If not, then so be it. The expedition's goal had been achieved anyway. Climbers Hornbein and Unsoeld continued to insist on their idea. In his diary, Dierenfurt calls this insane fanaticism. Hornbein came into conflict with glaciologist Maynard Miller when he said, "Now that the mountain has been conquered, we must focus our main efforts on scientific research." However, the climbers did not agree. For them, only the new route along the western ridge was important. During the ascent by Whitaker and Gome, 75 of the 95 oxygen cylinders allocated to the team were used up. But Dierenfurt still wanted to send a second group on the classic route. Resources were running low, and he was faced with a choice: send a few more groups on the classic route, which was almost 100% guaranteed to succeed, or trust Hornbein and Unsoeld and take a chance on this crazy first ascent. Meanwhile, Unsoeld, Hornbein, Corbett, Emerson, expedition radio operator L. Outen, and 5 Sherpas were busy carrying supplies up the western slope to continue equipping Camp 3 and set up Camp 4 at an altitude of 7,500 meters. On the night of May 16th, storm winds on the western slope nearly put an end to their endeavor. Hornbein and Unsoeld were sleeping in their tent at Camp 4. Unsoeld recalls, "We were suddenly awakened by the cry of L. Outen, who stuck his head in the door and shouted to us that the tents had been blown away. It took us a while to comprehend this, but eventually we decided to go out and check. Where the 4-man tents should have been, we found only a furrow in the snow leading down into the darkness." Unsoeld, Hornbein, and Outen proceeded down the slope 45 meters toward Tibet, where they found the overturned tents with Corbett and Tashi Sherpa still inside. Corbett recalls, "None of us were hurt. I just dragged my hands along the floor of the tent. The floor had become the ceiling, and the ceiling had become the wall. We didn't know where we were going. And it was very scary because the western cirque lay to the south of us, and at that moment we were on top of a rock several kilometers high. The tents were torn, but no one was hurt." Unsoeld recalls, "One large beam stuck out like a pylon in the middle, and a torn piece of fabric fluttered in the wind like a flag. There were huge holes and tears all over the tent." Corbett and Tashi Sherpa spent the night in the destroyed tent, while Outen lay down with Hornbein and Unsoeld. The next morning, the wind picked up, reaching gusts of 160 kilometers per hour. The men lay face down, holding onto their ice axes to keep from being blown into the sky above China. The storm finally subsided, but the consequences were dire. The West Ridge team had lost too much equipment to set up and staff the last 2 camps they had planned for their summit attempt. Corbett says, "We also thought that the West Ridge was doomed and that this climb would not happen, but Hornbein came up with a new plan that night. He nudged the sleeping Unsoeld in the ribs with his knee and began to speak. Instead of trying to set up and stock 2 additional camps above the 4th, they would all climb to an altitude of 8,700 meters and set up a single 2-person tent as their camp. The support group would descend, and Hornbein and Unsoeld would spend the night there and attempt to climb the remaining 600 meters to the summit via a steep couloir of crumbling rocks. Then they would descend to the South Col and spend the night at Camp Vi, and it was a truly insane plan. Spending the night at an altitude of 8,700 meters was practically a death sentence, and they were going to spend the night at that altitude, climb to the summit, cross it, and descend via the classic route through the South Col, spending another night at Camp 6, that is 2 nights above the death zone. It was unbelievable. But surprisingly, when they radioed their plan to Dierenfurt, he agreed. I don't know what influenced him. Perhaps the fact that Everest had already been conquered by Americans and it was possible to take the risk, or maybe someone simply persuaded him. In any case, the ascent via the West Ridge was approved. In his notes, Hornbein aptly described his plan as a last desperate attempt. By the standards of the time, the idea of climbing 1,000 meters vertically over steep, unknown, unprotected terrain in 2 days, all at an altitude above 7,500 meters, and then descending via an unfamiliar route was tantamount to suicide. And if something went wrong after setting out on the second day, the terrain would be too steep, they would not have enough equipment, and they would simply not have the strength to descend back down. After Corbett and the Sherpas left them at Camp 5, they had to either reach the summit or die. However, if they succeeded, this climb would go down in history. The 1963 American team originally planned to make a classic-style ascent, but on May 22nd, Hornbein and Unsoeld ushered in a new era of mountaineering, bold, light, and fast alpine-style ascents, which subsequently had a major impact on the development of mountaineering. On the night of May 21st, Corbett, Outen, and teams of 5 Sherpas led Hornbein and Unsoeld to a 45 centimeters wide ledge just below a band of sandstone known as the Yellow Band. Climber Corbett recalls, Ank Dorge climbed up with his load. Gasping for breath, he sat down, tore off his oxygen mask, clamped a cigarette between his teeth, and lit it. We were at an altitude of 8,400 meters. The team helped Hornbein and Unsoeld prepare a place for their 2-person tent and said goodbye, knowing that they might be seeing them for the last time. Corbett says, all 3 of us admitted that we were crying under our oxygen masks. That evening, Hornbein and Unsoeld ate a meal meant for 4, chicken soup with rice and a serving of grapefruit. Hornbein wrote a letter to his wife, which he would only see again if he made it to the summit. At 4 a.m., they woke up, ate, strapped on their crampons in the dark, and shortly before 7 a.m. left camp for good. First, they climbed a couloir that cut through the Yellow Band. Where the couloir narrowed at the top, they had to hammer pitons into the crumbling rock. By noon, they had reached the upper slopes of the mountain, but they got lost and couldn't figure out which way led to the summit. Willi Unsoeld recalls, the mountain is so huge, and the view from it is so different when you are right in the center of it, that we couldn't figure out whether we were in the westernmost or easternmost couloir. They contacted Whitaker at base camp via radio to ask if he could give them directions, but he could hardly see anything because of the blizzard that raged on the day of the ascent. And when Willi Unsoeld told Whitaker that they had already passed the point of no return, Whitaker immediately tried to persuade them to turn around and descend. The recording of their conversation reads, "Hey guys, I want you to think this through carefully. I don't like this at all. It's always good to have a backup plan for getting off a mountain, but the climbers refused to descend." Hornbein and Unsoeld decided that traversing back to the west ridge would lead them to the summit. At 3 p.m., in the middle of the traverse, they reached a rocky slab and stopped to eat some smoked salmon. At almost the same time, unbeknownst to them or anyone else in the expedition, the assault team climbing the classic South Col route reached the summit. They were 2 other climbers from the Durinford expedition, Bishop and Ørsted. They were 300 meters above Unsoeld and Hornbein. The team reached the summit at about 3:15 a.m. in strong winds. Although they had a radio, they couldn't get it to work. Therefore, the Rinford and the others did not know that they had reached the summit or what had happened to them. By today's standards, Bishop and Ørsted arrived much later than reasonable, saw no sign of the West Ridge team, and thought they had turned back and begun their descent. However, Hornbein and Unsoeld, of course, had no time to turn back. When they finished traversing back to the ridge itself, a series of rocky cliffs awaited them. Finally, at 6:15 p.m., Unsoeld stopped and began to examine the rope. In an interview with Bishop after the climb, he described the moment when he saw the flag that Whitaker had planted 3 weeks earlier. He says, "Suddenly, trudging along with my head down, I looked up and saw the American flag about 12 meters ahead of me, shining in the slanting rays of the sun and fluttering in the wind. It was wrapped around a peg once and was slightly frayed, so the climbers ascended to the highest point on the planet, Mount Everest, via the West Ridge, following a new, incredibly difficult route. They stood on the summit, but there was no time to celebrate. The day was coming to an end, and they still had a long way to go down. Reaching the summit is one thing, but most accidents happen on the descent. At the summit, Willi Unsoeld turned on his radio and reported the ascent. Maynard Miller responded from Camp 2. He was overjoyed, but wanted to know if there were any traces of Bishop and Ursted, who had lost contact and were missing on the mountain. "Yes," replied Unsoeld. "We can see a faint trail of footprints. We can barely make them out in the thick twilight. We can reach them. Without them," he recalls, "I'm sure we would have descended the wrong ridge." These footprints became our guide. For the next hour, the pair descended blindly. They clumsily rappelled down the famous Hillary Step and soon plunged into darkness. Hornbein recalls, "Willi disappeared from view on the saddle. I shouted for him to wait. Unsoeld's lantern was almost out, and the tracks were out of sight. We descended aimlessly until I suggested changing the batteries one last time. There were none left, and then we saw the tracks again. We started shouting into the darkness, and someone shouted back." Unsoeld recalls, "For the first time in my life, I used the international distress signal, 3 yodels in a row. We had almost lost hope when suddenly we heard a response. Bishop and Ursted were still descending. They had lost their way and were just sitting in the snow, which was a bad sign. That's how climbers die." Ursted recalls, "It was around 7:30 p.m. when we first heard their voices. At one point, we thought we were going crazy. Who could be on the top of the mountain at night? We shouted, 'Who's there?' They shouted back again. On the second or third time, we realized that they weren't shouting from below." Hornbein began to descend in the darkness toward the voice, but suddenly lost his footing. "He jumped off the cliff and vanished into thin air," recalls Unsoeld. "We were tied together with a static rope, and the sudden jerk nearly broke each other's ribs, but I managed to hold him back." 2 hours later, Hornbein and Unsoeld stumbled upon 2 huddled figures sitting in the snow, apparently waiting to die. Bishop and Ursted were in a very bad situation. All the climbers were halfway between the summit and Camp 6, and it was already 9:30 p.m. and pitch dark. They had been climbing for more than 14 hours straight. Only Hornbein, whose regulator had probably broken, had a little oxygen left. Bishop was in the worst condition. Hornbein took a couple of dexedrine tablets, a drug based on substances that are now banned, out of his shirt pocket and gave one to Bishop and the other to Ursted. Unsoeld recalls, "We walked and walked, stumbling, falling, and getting up again, waking Barry when he fell asleep. He would sit down and immediately fall asleep. We felt like animals, but our instincts took over, and we slapped him on the cheeks to get him back on his feet. We kept telling him, 'Anyone can walk 100 feet. It's only 100 feet. Keep going.' And around midnight, having exhausted their last reserves of strength and unable to move forward, the climbers decide to spend the night in the middle of the mountain without a camp. Even with modern equipment, spending the night at an altitude of over 8,500 meters without a tent or sleeping bags sounds like a death sentence. It is almost guaranteed to lose fingers and possibly hands and feet to frostbite if you survive at all." Dry lightning flashed over the plains of India in the east. There was no moon. They were supposed to die, but despite the temperature of -27 degrees Celsius, the night was unusually calm. Ursted recalls, "Willi and Tom found a good spot. Barry curled up in a ball, and I wandered around in circles, unable to see where I was going. Once, I almost fell off a cliff while looking for a place to lie down." Bishop remembers it this way, "I actually enjoyed the view every time I opened my eyes. I tried to move my toes all night, but I couldn't tell if they were moving or not." Willi Unsoeld took off Hornbein's boots and socks and began rubbing his feet to fight frostbite. This is probably the only reason Hornbein did not lose his toes. He says, "I couldn't feel anything, but he must have massaged them for at least an hour, but I didn't feel a thing." The sky cleared at 4:30 a.m., but the men remained where they were until the sun rose above the horizon an hour later. By this time, Bishop was already delirious, but somehow he began to descend with the others. He says, "I remember Tom patting me on the head as if I were a beagle. They kept encouraging me." Willi was also a little out of it, and Hornbein says, "We left them behind without realizing how tired they really were. We turned the corner at the rocks, and Dave Dingman was waiting for us there. It turned out he had been following the bodies and was very surprised to find us alive." At 10:30 p.m., after a short sleep and tea at Camp 6, the exhausted group reached Camp 2 about 40 grueling hours after starting the climb. During the descent, Unsoeld contacted his wife Jolene, who was at the American Embassy in Kathmandu, by radio and told her, "I promise this will be my last big climb." Jolene replied, "Remember those words. I have a lot of witnesses this time." The soles of their feet were sore and stiff. The next morning, they descended to cross the icefall for the last time. They stopped at the spot where Breitenbach had died. Bishop said, "Well, Jake, we took this mountain for you." Breitenbach's body was not recovered from the icefall until 1969. From base camp, the Sherpas carried Bishop and Ansoff to Namche Bazaar, where they could be flown back to Kathmandu by helicopter. Ansoff lost 9 toes, Bishop lost all 10. And what is the result? Despite the fact that 60 years have passed since that ascent, this route is still one of the most technically difficult in mountaineering. Only a few people have climbed it, and the mortality rate among climbers on this track is incredibly high. It should be remembered that Hornbein and Ansoff were the first to climb it and pave this unknown route themselves with equipment that was 60 years old, although for its time it was, of course, very cool and innovative. But whoever is the first American on Everest is a hero. Therefore, all the laurels go to Whitaker. Although, of course, his ascent via the classic route was much easier than via the West Ridge, but little is said about Hornbein and Unsoeld's ascent. For the average person, whoever was the first American on Everest gets all the credit. As expected, the press perceived their heroic feat only as an added bonus to Whitaker's ascent, rather than as the main achievement of all climbers of that time. It was Whitaker who became the face of the expedition. He got the lead role in Orson Welles' film, The Americans on Everest. However, over the years, Hornbein's book Everest, The West Ridge, gained popularity among climbers. In his book Into Thin Air, John Krakauer named Hornbein and Unsoeld as his first heroes. Despite promising his wife that he would stop climbing, Willi Unsoeld took his daughter to the Garhwal Himalayas in India in 1976 to attempt to climb the mountain, after which his daughter was named Nanda Devi. His daughter, Devi Unsoeld, died in a high-altitude camp tent. Her father and fiancé were with her. Willi Unsoeld later included this incident in his lectures, often lightening the somber episode with humor. 2 years later, Unsoeld died with one of his students in an avalanche on Mount Rainier. The West Ridge of Everest remains one of the most difficult Himalayan routes, and will probably always be so, despite all the progress that has been made. Over the past 60 years, only 17 climbers have repeated this ascent, and 13 have died attempting to follow the Hornbein and Unsoeld route. This is the story of the first Americans on Everest and the first ascent of the West Ridge, one of the most significant climbs in mountaineering, which, unfortunately, is rarely talked about. Write whatever you think about this climb in the comments below the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I know that many people watch me without subscribing. Subscribe, it's not difficult for you, and I'll be happy. And recommend the channel to your friends. I'm sure they'll find it interesting too. See you at the top.